So welcome to ECSA's second workshop on diversity in citizen science. Today we will be focusing on inclusivity in citizen science. And this is hosted between ECSA, their working group on empowerment, inclusiveness and equity, Cause for Cloud and DNOSES. So Cause for Cloud is a community which is creating new citizen science technologies, and we host lots of co-design workshops which you can get involved with. So you can just scan these links, or we'll post links in the chat, which you can just take a look at later if you'd like to get involved. The agenda for today is we'll be having speaker presentations from Kylo Thomas from the Makerspaces project, Judy Ling Wong from the Black Environmental Network, and Monica Ramirez-Andreotta from Project Harvest. If you have any questions at all for the speakers, please do use the chat box and we'll answer those after the presentations. And then we'll go into breakout rooms for discussions where you can bring your own experiences and ideas about inclusivity in citizen science to identify barriers and also practical ways that we can overcome those. So just again, please do use the chat box throughout for your questions and make use of the links that we post there. Brilliant. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And Kylo, if you would please like to just introduce yourself and make your presentation.
Hey everyone, my name's Kylo, my pronouns are he, they, and I am part of the Making Spaces project. And I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it's going to work. Yes. Okay. Is it going to work? Yeah. Great. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Great. Oh, hang on. Okay, hello everyone. It's an absolute delight to be invited to talk to you all today. I was really pleased to get the email. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our project, which is called Making Spaces Project. And it looks at empowering young people through liberatory practices in makerspaces, and it's based at UCL. But what I thought I would do first is I'm going to read you a spell. And this spell is a radical gratitude spell, and it's a spell that I like to, or a poem that I like to share with other community organisers and other people engaging in environmental and social justice. And it's by a person called Adrienne Marie Brown, and she's a doula, she's a community activist, and she's an abolitionist, which is a word I'll get onto in just a minute. So a radical gratitude spell. Okay, so you are a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder in a world which seeks to own your joy and your imagination. You have chosen to be free every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles that you went through to get here, but I know you have swum upstream, and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is larger than yourself and your journey to love the particular container of life that is you. You're enough, your work is enough, you are needed, your work is sacred, you are here, and I am grateful. So the reason why I read this is because it's kind of at the heart of our project. Notions of care, accountability, a love ethic, and community, and abolition. So this word, which I'll go on to talk to a little bit now, is, let me just move this down here 1 minute, it's taking up the screen. abolition sparks up a lot of things for people, and it's become a bit of an in vogue term actually lately. But because it sparks up a lot of things, what I would do is I thought I'd just give you a little intro. And this is taken from our Making Spaces website, where we've got a whole glossary of words which we use for our work, and that people can refer to if they like. So for us, an abolitionist vision means building models today that represent how we want to live in the future. Abolition includes practical strategies towards liberation and empowerment, which allow us to all believe that things can be different. Abolition is living this vision in our everyday lives. It is both a tool for organisation and a long-term goal. An abolition comes from, or a big abolitionist, if not the biggest abolitionist, is Angela Davis. And she says, we seek to build movements that not only end violence, but that create a society based on radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity. In this society, safety and security will not only be premised on violence, will not be premised on the violence or the threat of violence. It will be based on a collective commitment to guaranteeing the survival and the care for all people. And abolition, again, is kind of at the heart of our project. And when we think about abolition, we always refer to Black feminism. We recognise that the creators of abolition are Black, Brown, Indigenous and Asian people, and that they lead abolition in their kind of resistance to white supremacy and resistance to colonialism. And this is important because when we think about colonialism, we also have to think about how that affects pretty much every person who's been pushed to the margins in society. Colonialism affects trans and gender non-conforming people because colonialism created the gender binary. Colonialism affects queer people because colonialism created heteronormativity and told everybody who they should and shouldn't love. Colonialism affects people with disabilities because colonialism tells us that the ideal body is white and male. So therefore, when we think about abolition in this particular way and community engagement and kindness and care and thinking forward, we're talking about liberating pretty much everybody. Okay, so this is sort of a theoretical framework for us. If we just, there we go. So our project looks at something called makerspaces, sorry. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with makerspaces, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of an overview. Makerspaces are community sites where people come together to build things and to create things together. That's at their heart. And they were born originally from activism and trying to sort of work together to build things. However, these spaces have become co-opted, particularly by white middle-class cisgendered men. And that means they've sort of fallen into ideals surrounding neoliberalism and building types of technology which are certainly not community-centered. So what our project is trying to do, or is doing in fact, is thinking about how we can reimagine these spaces, or indeed imagine them entirely if we're going to return to the idea of abolition and dreaming forward. And in order to do this, originally with the project, instead of calling these spaces makerspaces, which is sort of a name sort of very much linked to the global north, think instead about spaces where things are made. Because that puts a completely different swing on it, because many things are made in different spaces, and how it is that we can make these sites for liberation and empowerment for young people from under-resourced communities. And in order to do this, we've been working with 3 incredible spaces: Norwest Media Centre in Bristol, Mad Lab in Oldham, and Institute of Making in London. And together we've built sort of 4 resources, or 4 things called springboards for practitioners to look to or to turn to if they're going to think about reimagining makerspaces. And we think together about reimagining the values of a makerspace, reimagining the space of a makerspace, and reimagining the things that get made in a makerspace. So I'm going to take you through these in sort of a fly-by fashion, because I'm very much aware that I only have 10 minutes, so you can feel free to ask me questions. First of all, we've been working at the idea about reimagining values of these spaces, or if you're going to engage in community action. And one thing we've been encouraging or working together to achieve is how organizations can support communities and facilitate social action and promote environmental sustainability, as well as embedding a culture of shared values and centers around notions of care and sustainable well-being. And when we think about sustainable well-being and care, we think about the ideas of building trusting relationships, respecting community knowledges, needs and experiences, and most of all, values that center around reparation and accountability. So in order to make community spaces, in order to make STEM-driven community spaces, we need to first of all think about how it is that we're going to make those spaces function and be accountable for one another within those spaces. Because within that, then they can function on an even level and everybody's voices can get heard. In terms of environmental sustainability, it's very much about making sure that we're not being wasteful and using what is around the community and what's already there. And the image there you can see is one of the spaces that we work with, Noel West Media Centre, and the young people were doing a project on social action, and they were brainstorming all the things that they wanted to look at in their building. So if you look at that more detail, we've got all sorts of wonderful things that they were prototyping and designing, things to build for their community. Next, we think about reimagining the space of a makerspace. And what we think about there, what we encourage spaces to do, is recognize that a makerspace or a space doing anything are not just physical spaces, and they're certainly never neutral spaces. No space is neutral. All spaces are complex and they're part of different levels of oppression and power, and it's about breaking those down. And it's about recognizing that spaces that might seem safe for some people are not safe for others, even if you have lots of diversity awards. I'm a trans person, there's lots of spaces that I don't feel safe in, even if they have a Stonewall badge, and even if because they simply have not been built for me. So one thing we need to do together is work with those groups, work with individuals, listen to one another, essentially, to try to create safer spaces. And recognize, yeah, that, and why I use the word safer here, sort of very, instead of safe, because again, no space can be truly ever entirely safe for all people. So we just work to make them safer at this point until we can imagine these wonderful futures and they come to pass. We think a lot about or work with participatory approaches. It's super important that everybody is involved in creating the makerspace, and it's not about building for, but rather creating with and sort of dreaming forward. So it's very much making sure that everybody is working together, and the community as a community are entirely in control of the creation of this space. And if we look at the images at the side then there, that again is at Noel West Media Centre, and it was the entire community came together to create a sign to go on the front of their centre. And in order to do this, there was lots of discussion about what this sign means for the community. It was about engaging lots of people in the community to contribute. And along with that, it was the idea about writing a manifesto and working together. Thirdly, we reimagine the things that get made in a makerspace. So we can say that that's objects, or we can say that anything incites the emerging technologies, what's being made in those spaces. And we work to recognize that majority of things that are made in makerspaces, or indeed any sites of emerging technologies, are generally in the interests of the most privileged and often exclude other communities. If we think about the technologies that are being created now in Silicon Valley, I think we can definitely all agree that they're not built for everybody, and sometimes that they're implicitly and explicitly obvious in that fact. Ruha Benjamin talks a lot about discriminatory design, and looks actually at the bus stop seats as a really good example of designs which are incredibly exclusionary, but we just take them as what they are. And then within that, then we value and support inclusive and liberatory approaches to making. So we make sure that values, that knowledges and methodologies and types of making are respecting those are practiced by marginalized communities. And a really good space to look at here is communities such as the hip hop community, who've been building and making things for a long time, but are often neglected because they're not considered science, they're not considered STEM enough. Different types of creating and making, which happens by using what's around, and sustainability. Different types of making that basically don't fulfill what we're told that STEM should be or that making should be. And if we turn to the two images at the side, Institute of Making did a wonderful session with young people over the summer where they explored facial recognition software, and how that's being and how that operates in society. And with them also worked on something called CV Dazzle, which is a way that you can hide from surveillance effectively, and it's very cool. And below that is a prototype of a bed, a backpack bed that a young person built, particularly for homeless people. So the idea is that within that bed, they will be able to carry that around on their back, and therefore when they sleep, they'll be off the ground. And also the young person was very much into the idea that it had to be beautiful, that the things that we make don't have to be, or the things that we make don't have to be, I don't know, drab, I guess, that things can be beautiful. So here's some ideas about the importance of things that get made in these spaces. So within the project, we're talking about how these three particular ideals can function together, along with many other ideals, to try to make these spaces as liberatory as possible. But you can ask me questions later. And here's just a thanks to our lovely spaces that we work with, and a small reading list if people would like to engage and read more about some of the things that I've been discussing. Thanks.
Thank you, Kylo. That was absolutely brilliant. Please do feel free, everyone, to put questions into the chat if you had any that came up in Kylo's presentation. Judy, would you like to go ahead, introduce yourself and make your presentation, please?
It's my pleasure to be here with you all to share something of the journey of Black Environment Network. We started in 1987, over 30 years now. We pioneered the field of work now known as multicultural environmental participation. I will start by setting the scene and then continue on to practical actions. Black Environment Network was founded at a time when the environmental sector was purely about nature conservation. If you were not already a convert to working for nature, these organizations were simply not interested in you at all. It was not even about whether you were black or white. People were not on the agenda. Proposing that nature could benefit people's lives was seen as a very strange idea in those days. We challenged the environmental sector by asserting that there is no such thing as a purely environmental project. A so-called purely environmental project is one that has neglected its social, cultural, and economic dimensions. Our work shifted the people for nature paradigm to a two-way street paradigm of people for nature and nature for people. The agenda of diversity, equality, and inclusion historically comes from very different directions. The impetus for the Black Environment Network's work is a vision of multicultural inclusion. At the present time, we're living through a historical moment for working with diversity, equality, and inclusion. With the death of George Floyd, we see the Black Lives Matter movement sending a deep wave of emotion through the population, not only nationally in the USA, but internationally, unleashing actions through creating a mood of outrage and support for change. It is a historical moment born of tragedy that has been taken as a symbol for a time of transformation, with an impetus that we can all take full advantage of. Who we are and what we can achieve depends on how we see ourselves against the enormous pressure of how others see us. This is true for all of us, but particularly relevant to disadvantaged groups that suffer from prejudice of any kind. At the present time, the goodwill is evident, but goodwill is never enough. It is when we purposefully translate goodwill into effective action that it becomes powerful. Right now, there feels like there's real light in the darkness. The mood of the whole world is urging us on for transformation. For each of us, there's a challenge to recognize the continuing legacy of colonial history, exclusion, discrimination, and exploitation on the basis of mistaken concepts of race. We are one race, human race. In organizational terms, it is about structurally opening up inclusion, paying attention to equal opportunities for participation in environmental activities, and diverse representation in positions of decision-making and leadership. In policy terms, the key point is addressing diversity and equality translates into people-centered environmental policy. We are moving towards COP26, so paying attention to climate justice through people-centered policy has to be on the agenda. This is close to the heart of our multicultural communities, as it involves their countries of heritage right across the world. People-centered actions necessarily challenge us to move beyond traditional boundaries to come closer to other sectors. Different sectors have very different roles to play, with their strengths and their omissions. The human rights sector, the design sector, the voluntary sector that works closely with communities on the ground, and the health sector all have particular roles to play within people-centered environmental policy. The arts too have a role to play in putting into place transformative, heart-based understanding that fuels motivation. For organizations new to the work of reaching out to multicultural communities, I would like to share that in 30 years of environmental participation, I can summarize the whole process in 2 short and simple phrases. We love what we enjoy, and we protect what we love. We often hear about the white middle classes dominating the environmental agenda, but let us remember that the environmental movement is very young. It was started in the 1970s by the white middle classes. I always thank them because without them, there would be no environmental movement at all. But we need insight into why this is so. Within the 2 phrases, we love what we enjoy and we protect what we love, that I just shared with you, is the explanation of why it was the white middle classes that started everything to protect nature. They grew up in gardens. At the weekends, they take their children and go out in their cars to the most beautiful natural places. Their children grow up enjoying nature and family. So they have the human process that we come to love what we enjoy set within their lives. And then when they're told, hey, what you love is being destroyed, the next human process comes into play. They come out fighting for what they love, protecting it. In the first part, we love what we enjoy, is the issue to access, to contact with the beauty and enjoyment of nature by everyone. That is the first step to improve living conditions and access to nature for the disadvantaged that live in bleak concrete jungles of our cities, where most multicultural communities are. In the early days, Ben worked with environmental organizations to take people out to enjoy nature as of right. When people enjoy themselves, they also want to know more and then to help out. Volunteering and involvements like working with citizen science then naturally happens. The missing contribution begins to take shape, while at the same time, this new enjoyment and joining the main community becomes part of their lives. Progressing through this process, in the UK, we're now very far from square one. There's a rising generation of multicultural environmental activists and experts. In the beginning, we had to train the staff of environmental organizations to learn to provide a welcome and mentored them to work confidently with minorities. That capacity is now in the mainstream. We're now working with visibility and changing the picture of how multicultural communities are seen. They are contributing and they have something to say as multicultural voices. These are new frontiers. One of these new frontiers is the role of the media. When the organization Dog Society challenged the media on why they're not showing minorities already leading in the environmental sector, they said, "Where do you find them?" The response was research leading to the Climate Reframe Open Database Project, showing 100 multicultural environmental activists and experts that the media, any conference and event organizers can contact and use. This changes everything. So let's summarize the process of actions for inclusion. I'll put the list in the chat so there's no need to take notes. Theme 1, building capacity of environmental organizations to provide a welcome to multicultural communities through putting diversity and equality training into place. 2, provide equal access to contact with nature and the benefits of nature, especially in the most deprived urban areas where most multicultural communities live and work. 3, build, maintain, and develop ongoing relationships with multicultural groups. 4, nurture emerging voices and put multicultural representation and leadership within organizational structures for decision-making, sharing power. 5, co-create people-centered policies and strategies and programs of activities. 6, build aspiration and equal opportunities to take up environmental careers. 7, grant makers can use the power of funding criteria to put diversity and equality into place. 8, finally, in this era of the creation of new jobs, in the green recovery and net zero strategies, ensure that multicultural communities have access to the training and support that enable them to get their share of the cake. Citizen science is a wonderful area of participation. I look forward to seeing it take its place as part of the lives of multicultural communities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was really lovely. Everyone, please do check out the chat for those principles and leave your questions in the chat as well, and we'll come back to them in a minute. Monica, if you'd please like to introduce yourself and make your presentation now.
All right, thank you so much to Judy and Kylo. My name is Monica Ramirez. My pronouns are she, her, and I am in Arizona right now. I need to be able to share the screen. And so before I begin, thank you all very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with the European Citizen Science Association. So before, as I begin, I'll put a timer here. As I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on occupied Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki indigenous lands, and that our university sits on the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is giving a sprinkle sprinkling in the different types of frameworks that are used in Project Harvest, and then talking about what worked and what didn't work when engaging different environmental justice communities, whether they were urban or rural, across the state of Arizona. Before I begin, I do want to dedicate this presentation to Roy C. Chavez. Roy C. Chavez was dedicated to transforming the business as usual model, and taught me and was a community champion in the town of Superior. And unfortunately, we lost Roy to COVID-19 this past year. So this is one of a community partner that unfortunately did pass away. When we talk about like who I am and what I do, right? So I'm Mexican American. I grew up on the Arizona-Mexico border. So I'm with what's under like the La Paz agreement, that we recognize that the border region is this unique social and ecosystem that needs to be protected. But while living here, right, and having family on both sides, I've bared witness to social and environmental degradation that has truly informed who I am and what I do today. So I'm trained in these areas that you see here, right? But wanting to give a massive shout out to my nana, my abuela, my grandmother in the upper right, who, as she stated, held my dad in so that he could be a US citizen and so that we could have our life in the United States because of the different types of challenges that were being experienced in Mexico. And so with that, I hold great pride to who I am, Chicana, Mexican American, right? An athlete and silly, and I'm dedicated to my community. And so the core goal with all of this, right, is to use an environmental justice framework, right? A framework that asks the difficult questions and you have to ask those ethical and political questions that challenge why we have the disparities that we see today. And so using this environmental justice framework, my lab works to achieve environmental health and climate justice for all. Project Harvest, right, was what the project that I'll be using as an example to exemplify the mechanisms that can be used to essentially break down barriers and create structural change. So Project Harvest is iterative and dynamic, meaning that while these are community questions, right? So the biggest thing is Project Harvest, the question for the project stemmed from these community members who are trying to do the right thing of growing their own food, harvesting rainwater to reduce their water footprint, but then are curious because they know about pollution, if there's pollutants in harvested rainwater systems, right? So we started to look at this suite of, you can see the contaminants that we are looking at. But this team is rooted, right? You can see that top row of women. These are the promotoras. These are the community health workers. These are the women who are indigenous into the communities in which we're engaging and serving and working with. And they are incredibly critical to this project. But I will highlight, however, that this is a massive team of researchers, as well as students, researchers, community members, and community health workers. So with Project Harvest, right, I want to highlight three major things: cultural humility, right? Self-reflection, transdisciplinary, and interweaving knowledges, right? So that you're not driven by your discipline, you're driven to create new knowledge and innovation, and you're interweaving, right? Just visualize the analogy of making and interweaving different approaches that integrate widely diverse resources in full partnerships of mutual respect and understanding, as well as what we call deep engagement. So recognizing that when we're doing this type of co-created citizen science, that we are aiming for a level of deep engagement that recognizes all the internal and external factors that make each and every one of us, and that those are carried into our practice and what allows us to be dynamic and iterative. When we talk about being co-created, we do want to acknowledge equity-centered community design that was proposed by the founder of the Creative Reaction Lab. And we see here that in 2018, in response to police brutality and racial and health inequalities, the Creation Reaction Lab proposed this framework as a creative problem-solving process that was based on equity, humility building, and integrating history and healing practices, right? And so again, recognizing and looking at this larger systemic scope in which you're working in. And so I'm not going to go into great detail, but I did want to acknowledge, right, you are defining and assessing the topic and community needs. So that's like working with communities, inviting diverse co-creators. Again, I just showed you the picture of the promotoras and community members being part of this process, rapid prototyping, testing, and learning. And so this iterative dynamic space. So let's get into the nitty gritty, right? Project Harvest. Like I'm in Arizona, right? So here are the stats. Over 50% are from low-income households. 55 do not have a college degree. 50% self-identify as a person of color, recognizing we're in the Southwest, right? 42% are Latina, Latinx, and 25 speak Spanish as their dominant language. With this project, we employed a mixed methods approach to learning research and to answering the question in which you invited me here today. How do you engage? And so to do this, you have to have a mixed methods approach. So this is where we have written surveys, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, but we also did participant observation, formative and summative evaluation, analysis of journal entries for participants, and even analysis of the emails as they submitted over time throughout the project. So here I'm going to start beginning and showing some of the data. So this is showing self-efficacy as an indicator perhaps of how confident a participant might feel in doing this project. What you're seeing here is you're seeing the pre-participation and then 1 year after being part of Project Harvest. And so what you can see here is we have all community members represented in the first set of columns. And then you can see each of the communities, no worries here, this is the community names. And then we also divided out by sociodemographic factors. What I want to highlight here is there was no difference in pre-participation or change in 1 year in self-efficacy after being in Project Harvest. There was no difference based on community, race or ethnic group, income, or college graduates. And so the results importantly suggest that all those socioeconomic factors affect countless life outcomes, from educational attainment to physical health and mortality. They do not predict the success of a citizen scientist. And so these individuals came in with high self-efficacy and they maintained that self-efficacy throughout the project. Now let's go into very specific strategies that, right, if we're increasing diversity in citizen science programs. If you look at motivation, what's critical here to acknowledge is that in this work, right, and when we say non-traditional participants, these are defined as non-white, low income, and or participants without a four-year college degree. What we see here is that they are more likely to be motivated by an existing relationship, right? Or that the project will address a perceived risk. So the design strategy that I propose to you is that you build on existing and personal organizational relationships. You leverage participant motivation to connect with each other. You have those liaisons or the promotoras, community health workers, and you clearly connect research to identify community issues. In the communities that we're working with, I've been working in one community since 2006, another community since 2008, and two others that are part of it since 2015, right? So these are based and rooted on trust and partnership building. The other big thing is they're less likely to be motivated by learning for the sake of learning or contributing to science, right? And so the reason why this is critical to acknowledge is because a lot of previously motivation to contribute to scientific research has been cited, right? That they want to contribute to the science, but the findings here suggest that contribution to science as well as learning for the sake of learning may be motivations which apply disproportionately to white, college educated, and non-low income participants, right? Participants from communities of color were more likely and motivated by addressing a relevant problem or by working with someone they had an existing relationship with. All right, moving along. What do you need? You need to support these activities. So one of the things is they're more likely to be supported by the personal interaction than the written materials. So we spent a tremendous amount of time building information booklets in English and Spanish. We spent a lot of, making all of these written materials and a website. And in the end, it was like, hey, I want to work with my promotora. Can I just call you and figure it out with you? And so really we want to, acknowledge again, these liaisons are critical, build in opportunities for relationship building, have data sharing events, which I won't be able to focus on today, and build in that open communication and bidirectionality. Again, so this is you might get really, really nitty gritty stoked about your written materials. They're not going to be read as much as you want because it's really about the storytelling and face-to-face interaction. The other thing is barriers to participation, right? So we, spent a lot of time again on going on websites and interactive design, and 70% of our participants did not go online. right? And so when you find that out, you need to have, so this is where we're like, oh, shoot, right? We need to provide alternatives to digital participation. This is where a community health worker was like, hey, you're trying to have them send results to you. Why don't you just give them a paper worksheet to send in? I know that's a simple strategy, but it was we needed to hear that. The other thing is that time was a frequently reported barrier. And so you just allow and build in flexibility. So in Project Harvest, we have a tiered participation structure. You can do a lab methodology where you have to collect around certain time periods, or you can do a do-it-yourself method where you have a month to get the project done, and you can send us the results. And this level of flexibility was critical. I'm over time, but I did want to just end on the fact that it was very important to think about what data sharing, we spent a tremendous amount of time on data sharing. And what we know is that participants typically have these kind of questions that you see on the first column, and that you need to answer those questions in your data sharing practice. And I will, this is a final visualization that went through probably like over 10 iterations. We wanted to make sure we were communicating the data effectively. We've done formative and summative evaluation on all of this. We also needed to understand how participants were using their water, which is how we integrated the social science. And well, there's a lot of integration of disciplines here. And on that note, I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was so interesting. I think we'll start with a question for Kylo from Petra. So talking about taking back makerspaces, how do you do that when tech is quite expensive, and if you're fundraising, you rely on involving other funders? And secondly, since STEM experts are mainly male, white, of a certain age, how do you make that inclusive when typically the leaders in those environments are of that description?
Okay, thanks for the question. The first part of it. In terms of, I think like one thing that we are resistant to is the idea that in order to have a makerspace, you need things like 3D printers or all of this stuff that might be pulled into these spaces. What we work on is what the community already has and what that community needs on their own terms, in their own ways. So for us, it's less about, and the problem is, we think that there seems to be an idea with makerspaces that you get the laser cutter, if you get the 3D printer, that's what makes these spaces. Well, actually what makes these spaces is simply the idea of creating things together. And actually communities have a great deal of things that they have already. In terms of getting or fundraising, we believe in mutual aid. So for example, in terms of looking at, say, the digital divide, which definitely came up during COVID. So originally I was supposed to do the field work for this project and going to the spaces, and unfortunately everything got moved online. And one of the key problems then was not everybody has access to the internet, not everyone has access to a computer, and this really became very obvious. So the idea of doing digital drives and sharing what you already have, working within the community to use what's already there, and being resistant to the fact that you have to go to these big kind of funders for this, for what it is that you need, and kind of building it together. In terms of the space or experts, which again I'm kind of resistant to still being white cis men. Yeah, they are, but there are other ways to look at knowledge. There are other ways to look at STEM. It doesn't have to be through the lens of kind of white colonialism. Yes, they're there, but we don't have to engage with it. We have different ways in which we create technology. And that's been going on forever and more. So let's focus on those. And through those, we can make our own liberatory technologies, like, for example, the homeless bed, like, for example, ways in which we're working with young people to get around surveillance, because then that means that we can kind of we can begin to dismantle these things. I don't know if that was a bit of a...
That's all great, thank you. And just a question from myself as well. You brought up the making spaces feel safe for people who quite often don't feel safe in larger communities. How do you approach that, and how do you make spaces feel safe and also convince people that they will be safe in those spaces?
I guess, and that's a good question. And I think one thing is it takes time, and that relationships don't just occur overnight. And it's also about listening and about taking accountability. So another nice way to think about safe spaces, to think about accountability spaces, and making sure within those spaces people take care of it and also take responsibility for themselves, and having those conversations. And sometimes it will mess up. But that means then these conversations have to be had, and people need to, again, in reflective practice, and this is particular for practitioners coming in, the idea that to be reflexive, what does whiteness mean, what does being cisgendered mean, and not just, and really educating oneself, and then letting go of a lot of your own, letting it go. So basically it's about listening, is my simple answer, I guess.
Brilliant. And just one more, in terms of creating participatory work, how do you step back and take your own agenda out and really make it the community's project?
I think that it's always the community project to begin with. But one of the things that lead our project, especially with the young people, is we have advisory boards, and we work with them. So they've decided what it is that they want from these spaces. They've decided the things that the community desperately need. They've decided the things that need to be put in place. And I think it's definitely, especially working with young people, I feel there's lots of assumptions made about how much that they know, and they know a great deal. So I think it's sort of making sure, or like facilitating, and making sure that as much as possible one's agenda isn't going in. It's about working communally, and I don't know, creating a care web so we all just look after one another, which sounds like, well, yeah, I think that they need to be made everywhere. So
yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Julia has asked for some suggestions for a reading list. If anyone does know of any brilliant books or papers that you can read, please do drop them in the chat, speakers and everyone else present. Judy, just moving on to yourself, you were talking about how much goodwill there is at the moment, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement last summer. What ways have you found for translating goodwill, which a lot of people have, into actual action?
I think that in the UK, especially at this time, with the attention on COP26 and climate change and so on, people really want to elevate the new rising generation of Black and minority ethnic voices. So a lot of people are now including them on the advisory groups and working groups of organizations, so they can begin to lead and make the needs of communities actually known and be able to share the power of decision making. I think that level of engagement that we've arrived at in the UK is really important. Well, of course, when you work with multicultural communities, there are always new frontiers, because new people arrive from different places. They are at square one. Although as a movement, we've moved on from square one, they're always very vulnerable people, and they come from different parts of the world that really reflect the unrest in our contemporary world. And there's a lot to learn from these people about the stories of what's happened to them and so on. And they also bring expertise. Sometimes because people are vulnerable, we forget that they come with an enormous richness of expertise that you can also share. Many people know how to grow things beautifully. Many people know about wildlife in their own countries and so on. And we also have common wildlife. Sometimes you say, oh, British wildlife, so in a box. No, many of the things we have are right across the world. And sometimes we talk with environmental organizations about what we call multicultural interpretation, which is to really look at the species that you're working with. For example, we worked with the Bat Conservation Trust, and when they were going to a school with a lot of children that come from the subcontinent of India, they actually found that a lot of the bats that they were working with, they're the same bats in India. Now for the children, this was so wonderful because they then know that actually, you know, species, the ideal species and so on are in a way similar to people. They might look a little bit different when they're in different countries, but they're the same species. So you actually look at these bats and they line up pictures, you know, of the same species of bats in India, in the UK and so on. And they look slightly different, but they are the same bats. And as you know, in the UK, when we have tried to re-establish certain species we've lost, like the wonderful birds that we call kites, these huge birds that really are beautiful when we watch them fly. When we lost them all, what do? We look to Spain because they have the same birds. So we actually got those birds and re-established them in the UK. So all these things really matter when you think of multiculturalism, identify with different things and being able to say, you know, we actually have species in this country that are from the countries of origin of a lot of children too poor to go to visit their own countries of origin, but that emotional identity of being able to say, yes, these bats, these birds, we also have them in our country and they are here, is actually a wonderful connection as well.
That's amazing. And I think emotion is something that quite often is left out of citizen science because funding comes often from quite formal places. But you were talking about the importance of making these activities enjoyable, maybe even before you get to the actual nitty-gritty of the citizen science. How do you do that?
Well, first of all, you know, most of our multicultural communities are in urban areas. And when you go to the places where the poorest communities, poorest white and minority communities actually live, they're very bleak. There are very few green spaces, and when there are green spaces, they're very poor quality. So the investment in greenery where people actually live is really important. First of all, if you want people to connect with nature, the best thing to do is right outside their windows, isn't it? That you don't go miles away from where you live and go and benefit or even work for some nature reserve or beautiful places where rich people are living because they have these beautiful spaces. You want to actually improve where you live and enjoy them as well. So things like trees in streets are really important. Things like school grounds are important. So all these areas where people are spending a lot of time in are important to transform. And around social housing, council estates in the UK, we actually find that in some boroughs in London, in area, these spaces around social housing with the poorest communities actually have more acreage than the parks and gardens put together, but they're of the poorest quality. They come in, they mow the grass, they disappear. There's absolutely nothing on it. And they even lock these areas after they mow the grass. You can't even go and sit in the grass. So all these things are really important to notice. And these areas, like just mown lawns, very poor quality spaces, we can invest in them. In Liverpool, they have done imaginative places of transformation, where around social housing, they've changed these boring areas into wildflower meadows. You see children walking through these beautiful meadows covered in flowers and so on. And it's purely inspiration for both people and for nature.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Monica, in your projects, you were talking about the importance of community figures as kind of trusted people that communities can go to. How did you identify these people and kind of what recommendations would you make for identifying them in other communities?
Yeah, so I think that one aspect is that with Project Harvest and other projects is we have a sub-award for our urban partner. We have a sub-award going to a non-governmental community-based organization, which pay, acknowledging their overhead, right? So it's like really that looking at, I won't even unpack, but the equity in how you pay your partners and sub-awards is critical in all of this. And so they have, through their organization I've been working with for quite some time. And so they have a set of community health workers or promotoras for the Tucson area. For the other communities, what I did was just, you know, acknowledging, right, that I'm a like cultural knowledge broker in as well, right, going into these spaces and working with the partners that I had, writing up and basically the job position that acknowledged multiple forms of knowledge, wasn't tied to one type of like a formal training, right? You didn't have to, you know, I think it was like high school degree or, you know, equivalency. And so really writing a job posting that was acknowledging and inclusive of multiple forms of knowledge and partnering up with the community partners that you already had to properly get the word out.
Brilliant. And one of the big takeaways for me from your project was about making technology inclusive. And I think quite often we forget that something as simple as paper is a technology. What recommendations would you have for not just putting everything online or making every project digital in reaching communities in citizen science?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so I kind of am in my own, I would say, I mean, so one of the things I noticed is like, if you don't rely, so one way we got around it in addition to doing like mailings and whatnot was to use text messaging, like that texting was much more efficient and easy for someone to open a link on their phone versus expecting them to go onto a computer. But I will say that like ultimately I'm in a dilemma right now, right? Recognizing, and maybe others are as well, is recognizing that so much information is online. And so like, is it important to build this level of literacy within these spaces? Because is it because of the lack, because there's not going to be like the paper and the like ability to, so if like in the United States, right, when you have a contaminated site, all the material is archived in different online or federal agencies. And so you won't be able to necessarily get that information unless you go online. And so is it important to like teach that and go through that technological literacy, or is it, you know, do you still acknowledge, well, ultimately the way I've handled it is doing everything. But I did want to bring up that I feel like I'm in this dilemma of how much to go to talk about and teach and build technological literacy and address access and isolation issues, right? But I won't go off on that anymore.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to cover all bases. So just a final thank you so much to all of our speakers. Your presentations were absolutely brilliant and hopefully have given us all a lot to think about. And thank you all so much to everyone who's attended and joined in. Please do check out the resources and share the YouTube recording to anyone who couldn't make it but would find this useful. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.